They never expected her to be heard. The laughter in the Ashford estate rolled like bourbon in crystal. Out on the wide porch of the century-old plantation house, the summer air was thick with jasmine, and somewhere in the distance, cicadas buzzed with the weariness of old Southern secrets. Inside, beneath chandeliers brought over from Paris and portraits of men who'd never smiled kindly, the guests leaned back in their chairs and sipped from glasses that cost more than some people made in a month. And then Gideon Ashford tapped his glass for silence. Evie Mae, he called, not loudly but loud enough. "Come in here, child." She paused in the kitchen hallway, tray in hand, steam rising from bowls of gumbo her mother had been tending since dawn. Her shoes squeaked faintly on the marble not made for that floor. Eyes turned toward her, half curious, half amused. "You play piano, don't you?" Gideon asked. "Play us a little something. For fun." The room chuckled, the kind of chuckle that curled at the edges. One woman turned to another and whispered, "How precious." In the hallway behind her, her mother, Leona, froze mid-step. Evie didn't answer. She didn't nod. She just walked slowly, carefully across the polished floor, past the heavy curtains and oil paintings and rows of eyes that had never truly seen her. She approached the grand piano like one might approach a pulpit or a grave. The Steinway gleamed under chandelier light untouched since last Easter. She sat. And for a brief aching second, the room stilled not out of respect, but anticipation of a joke. Gideon leaned back, wine in hand, already smirking. Evie Mae placed her fingers on the keys, steady, small, and silent. And then she began to play. Before Evie Mae ever touched the grand piano in that chandeliered room, she had another piano. One with chipped keys, 3 broken pedals, and a split down the side like a scar that wouldn't heal. It sat slumped against the back wall of Mount Zion Chapel, a clapboard church just past the kudzu line behind the Ashford property. No one came there anymore. The last Sunday service had been held before Evie was born. Now it belonged to the wind and the dust and to whoever needed something quiet. Evie found it when she was 5. She hadn't been looking for a piano, just a place to hide. That morning, she'd spilled molasses on Mr. Ashford's linen tablecloth, and the head housemaid said she ought to keep her clumsy little fingers out the way if she wanted to stay out of trouble. So Evie ran. Through the back garden across the briars until she reached the old chapel. She pushed the door open and let it groan on its hinges. Inside, the sun poured in through a shattered stained glass window what was once a shepherd, now just a swirl of reds and yellows. Dust danced in the air like forgotten music. And there it was, the piano, bent, dry, quiet. She approached it like it might bite, placed one finger on a key, pressed. A note rang out, flat and distant like a voice remembering how to speak. That was the beginning. The first songs she played weren't really songs at all. Just sounds, combinations, patterns, like skipping stones over a still lake to see how far they'd go. But her hands remembered things, not from books, from blood. Because Miss Alberta, her grandmother, had once taught music at Cotton Hollow School, back when schools were still segregated, and respect for a black woman with talent was a tightrope walk over fire. Alberta had grown up reading Brahms in the morning and humming spirituals at night. She taught hundreds of children to read music to feel rhythm in their spine, until the state shut the school down. Budget cuts, they said. But Alberta still had her fingers, until she didn't. When Evie was 6, she noticed her grandmother's hands trembling while shelling peas. Not from age, but something slower. The doctor said it was arthritis, but to Alberta it felt like erasure. The world had stopped needing her music, and now even her own body was following suit. So she passed it on. She'd tap her cane for tempo hum when the notes felt wrong, nod when Evie got it right. They never had a real piano at home, just a kitchen table where Evie would drum her fingers across the wood in ghostly scales while Alberta counted 1 and 2 and 3. Yes, baby, that's it. And when Evie asked why they couldn't have a real piano, Alberta said, sometimes the best instruments are the ones nobody's watching, 'cause that's where you learn what's true. Years passed. Evie grew, and so did her music. Every morning before the mansion lights came on, she'd slip out of bed, tug on her coat, and make the walk to the chapel. She had it timed just right. If she left at 5:15, she'd get an hour to play before the head cook needed her back for breakfast prep. Her mother, Leona, knew, but never said a word. She'd just leave Evie's coat folded by the door and the back gate slightly unlatched. Some mornings were so cold her breath fogged the keys. Other mornings, the rain drummed the chapel roof like applause from heaven. It wasn't just practice. It was prayer. There, in that ruined sanctuary, Evie poured herself into the piano. She played fragments of her grandmother's songs, then twisted them, rewrote them, added notes that didn't belong until they did. She didn't know it, but she was composing, layering memory on memory, threading joy and sorrow and the heavy unspoken thing that clung to the air in every room she entered. She gave that feeling a sound. She didn't know the names of the chords, but she knew their weight. Sometimes when she played something new, she'd close her eyes and imagine an audience that didn't smirk, that didn't whisper, "Bless her heart," or ask her to play something simple like "Happy Birthday." In her imagination, the room was full of people who listened. One of them was always her grandmother, back in her old pressed suit, her hat tilted just so, sitting in the front row with her eyes closed and hands folded. Another was Leona, not in a service apron, but a soft blue dress, smiling with her whole face. And sometimes, just sometimes, Evie imagined someone she'd never met, maybe a music teacher or a stranger who'd hear her and say, "Child, where did you learn to play like that?" She never played for recognition. She played because the chapel listened. Because in that cracked building behind the vines where no one was watching, the music didn't have to prove anything. It just had to be. The invitation hadn't been a kindness. It was a test dressed up as charity, a gesture meant to amuse the powerful, not uplift the unseen. After dinner was cleared and the bourbon had done its work, Gideon Ashford leaned back in his mahogany chair like a man waiting to be entertained. "Evie Mae," he said again, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Let's give the folks something to remember." The room was thick with heat and old money. Heavy curtains muffled the outside world, and the fireplace crackled, though it was hardly cold. Around the parlor, heads turned toward the hallway, where Evie stood, tray in hand, body still. She hadn't moved since he called her. Leona stood just behind her, her hands wet from dishwater, her apron damp and creased. Her eyes locked on her daughter like a thread stretched tight across a canyon. "She doesn't have to, Mr. Ashford," Leona said quietly. "She's had a long day." Gideon chuckled and waved a dismissive hand. Now. She's just a child. It'll be fun. No harm in a little music. Go on, sweetheart." One of the guests, a woman in pearls and red lipstick, giggled. "Does she know Twinkle, Twinkle?" Another chimed in. "I'd love to hear that old church tune. What's it called? Wade in the Water." Laughter followed, soft but sharp, the kind that cuts with a smile. Evie looked down at the tray in her hands. Her fingers were trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of a choice. She could say no. She could lower her head, mumble something about being tired, and disappear back into the safety of the kitchen. Or she could walk forward, into a room not made for her, toward an instrument no one thought she deserved to touch. She took a breath, set the tray down on the sideboard with deliberate care, and walked. The floor felt too clean beneath her shoes, polished to a mirror by the same hands now curled at her side. She passed the table with its silver candelabras and untouched dessert plates. She passed the guests with their flushed cheeks and dangling diamonds. And she passed her mother, who stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, lips parted but silent. The Steinway loomed in the corner like a sleeping animal, glossy black, imposing, untouched for months, maybe years. It belonged more to the decor than to any musician. Evie stopped beside it. She didn't sit yet, just stood there for a moment looking at the keys. One row black, one row white, a pattern she'd memorized long before she knew her multiplication tables. Behind her, the room quieted, though the air still buzzed with unspoken expectations. "She's stalling," someone whispered. "She's scared," said another. "Let's hope it's short," muttered a third. Evie turned. "I can choose the song?" she asked. Gideon raised an eyebrow, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Of course," he said. "Anything you like. We're all ears." He was smirking. So were the others. They weren't expecting music. They were expecting a story to tell. A little maid girl plinking her way through a nursery rhyme. Something to laugh about over brandy. Evie sat. The bench was cold beneath her. She adjusted it just slightly the way her grandmother taught her, so her back would stay straight. Her hands relaxed, her breath steady, and then she placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't begin right away. First, she closed her eyes. Not because she was nervous, but because she needed to remember. The smell of old wood and mildew in the chapel, the morning frost on the stained glass, the rhythm of Miss Alberta's cane tapping the floor in 3/4 time. She wasn't playing for these people, not really. She was playing for the space that had held her when the world didn't care to, and for the woman who passed on music like a second language even after her hands gave out. She opened her eyes and began. The first notes were soft, almost too soft to hear over the fire, but they carried. A delicate melody, unfamiliar, not from the radio, not from church, not from anywhere the guests had ever been. Evie's fingers moved like breath-measured, unhurried sure. The room didn't fall silent all at once. It crept into stillness. A slow realization that the child they had summoned wasn't stumbling. She wasn't fumbling. She was playing. Really playing. Her hands moved across the keys with the certainty of someone who had worn grooves into invisible wood for years. She didn't rush, didn't show off. She told a story. In notes, a minor progression slipped into something hopeful. A tremble in the left hand echoing the grief in her mother's eyes some nights when she thought Evie was asleep. A sudden lift, like laughter through a screen door on a summer evening. Then a dip again, low and slow, like sorrow setting in the bones. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and no one in that room was laughing anymore. Evie played for 3 minutes and 29 seconds. She knew because that's how long it always took this piece she'd built out of memories and morning cold and her grandmother's hum. When the final note rang out, she didn't bow, didn't look up. She just let her hands rest on the keys. The silence that followed was different. Not awkward, not expectant, just still. Then Gideon cleared his throat. Well, he said too brightly that was, but no one answered, because something had shifted. They'd invited her to entertain them. Instead, she had made them listen. The room did not fall silent all at once. It was a silence that arrived slowly like evening fog rolling in across a field, soft at first, then heavy with realization. The last note from the piano still shimmered in the air, barely clinging to the high ceilings of the Ashford parlor before slipping into memory. And for several seconds, no one moved. No glasses clinked. No polite coughs. No rustling of napkins. Just stillness. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something they weren't prepared to understand. Evie Mae sat perfectly still at the piano bench. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, her back straight, her head slightly bowed, not in shame, but in reverence. She knew what she had given them, and she knew they didn't yet have the language to describe it. Gideon Ashford cleared his throat. Too loud. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his chest. He had expected a moment to gloat, a moment to chuckle, to pat himself on the back for showing the room how quaint and surprisingly talented the cook's daughter was. Instead, he felt displaced, like he'd invited a lamb into the room and accidentally summoned a storm. From the far corner, Mrs. Langford, the woman in pearls who had mocked Evie earlier, pressed a hand to her chest. "I didn't know children still played like that," she whispered. Someone else murmured, "That wasn't a song, that was a sermon." Evie's mother, Leona, stood frozen in the doorway, her hands gripping the edges of her apron so tightly the seams strained. Her lips trembled, but she made no sound. She wasn't sure what she felt more strongly, pride or fear. Because she knew that music like that came from somewhere deep, somewhere dangerous, somewhere people like them weren't supposed to touch in public, much less unveil in a room full of old names and older money. And yet Evie had done it. Without apology, without a smile, without asking permission. She had played truth into a room built on pretense. Her fingers had turned the polished Steinway into something sacred, something older than brands and bank accounts. The melody she offered wasn't one of triumph or defiance. It was something harder to name. A song made of memory and grit and the quiet weight of growing up knowing people saw through you, not to you. She had wrapped all that pain into a lullaby and dared them to listen. And they had. Victoria Ashford Gideon's teenage daughter sat curled on the velvet settee with her phone still in her hand. She'd filmed everything intending to post it with some snarky caption about staff kids getting bold. But now the phone was trembling, not from shame, but from revelation. She knew piano, had taken lessons since she was 5, had played recitals in polished churches, had trophies and YouTube videos with 1,000 views. But she had never played like that, not with that ache, that clarity, that purpose. What Evie had done wasn't just music. It was storytelling without words. And Victoria, though she would never admit it aloud, felt small. In the hallway, Leona finally stepped forward, crossing the threshold like it might burn her. "Baby," she said, her voice barely audible. "You done?" Evie looked up. Her eyes were calm. "Yes, ma'am." Leona swallowed, then offered her hand. Evie smoothed the front of her dress and walked back across the room, not with a child's shuffle, but with the quiet composure of someone who had already endured what others only feared. She passed Gideon without looking at him, past the guest still stunned into stillness, past Victoria, who for the first time couldn't meet her gaze, and she walked to her mother, who opened her arms, not wide but enough. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the dishes were washed, Gideon stood alone by the piano. He poured himself another drink, though he hadn't touched the last one. The Steinway loomed, now touched, now altered. It didn't gleam the same way. Something in it had changed. Or maybe something in him had. He pressed a key, let the note ring out. Flat, cold, empty. He frowned. He hadn't expected that. Not from her, not from anyone. Because Gideon Ashford had spent his whole life learning how to own things, houses, land, reputations. But tonight, a child had played a song in his house on his piano, and for a moment every eye had followed her. She hadn't asked for the room. She'd taken it. And he wasn't sure whether to feel offended or grateful. Across the yard in the quiet back house behind the garage, Evie sat on the edge of her bed. She hadn't spoken much since dinner. Her mother had warmed some soup, but it still sat untouched on the counter. She stared out the window at the chapel beyond the fence. The stained glass window caught just enough moonlight to glow. Tomorrow she'd go back to the broken piano, the crooked bench, the silence that welcomed her. But something had changed now. She had been heard. And though she hadn't planned it, though her hands had nearly betrayed her as she played, she had shown them. Not who she was, but who she refused to be forgotten as. By morning, the house was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the usual hush of servants moving softly through the halls, or the droning calm of wealth long grown bored with itself. No, this silence was different. It was the kind of stillness that lingers after something important has been said, and everyone's still pretending they didn't hear it. But someone had heard. Mrs. Eleanor Reese was the first to break the rules. She had stayed later than the others the night before. Her ride delayed, her curiosity stirred. She'd been a professor once music theory at Spelman College, and though retirement had softened her tone, it hadn't dulled her ear. She knew when a sound didn't belong. And last night, what that girl had played, it hadn't been practiced recital fluff. It hadn't come from sheet music bought in a mall or downloaded from YouTube. It had come from lived memory. It had been composed. Eleanor stood at the Ashford front door, now pressing the brass knocker like she had every right. And maybe, just maybe, she did. Leona opened the door, still in her kitchen apron, flour dust on her forearm. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I believe so," Eleanor said, her voice polite but firm. "I'm here to speak to your daughter." Leona stiffened. "If this is about last night." "It is." Eleanor nodded. "But not in the way you're thinking." She paused, then added gently, "I'd like to talk to her about what she knows, not what she's done." Evie Mae came out slowly, unsure of what to expect. Her fingers were still sore from the night before. She'd slept badly dreams, buzzing with faces that stared too long and words that had never been spoken. But Eleanor didn't look at her like the others had. She didn't smile too wide or crouch down like talking to a child. She just sat in one of the white wicker chairs on the porch and motioned to the seat beside her. Evie sat and waited. "I heard you play last night," Eleanor began, "and I need you to know something." Evie tensed. "You're not just good," she said. "You're real, and that scares people." Evie blinked. No one had said that before, not even her mother, not even Miss Alberta. "You didn't play a child's song," Eleanor continued. "You played legacy. You played grief and dignity and memory and hope, and you did it without flinching." Evie looked down. "I didn't mean to show off," she whispered. Eleanor laughed softly. "You didn't. You told the truth, and that's far more dangerous." By afternoon, word had spread beyond the Ashford estate. Someone no one knew who exactly had leaked the footage Victoria had filmed. Maybe it was the girl herself in a moment of reckoning. Maybe someone else at the party had forwarded it with a caption too clever for its own good. Either way, it was out, and it was being watched. At first by a few dozen, then a few hundred, then thousands. Comments flooded in. "Who is this girl? Why does a child from the kitchen play with more soul than half the concert pianists I've heard?" There's something holy in this. People didn't just share the video, they felt it. Because Evie wasn't perfect. Her fingers weren't always precise. But the sound, the feeling, was flawless. At the back of the property, Miss Alberta sat in her old rocker wrapped in a crocheted shawl. Leona had told her everything, and though her hands no longer moved like they used to, her eyes gleamed with something fierce. "She played it," Alberta asked, voice thin but sharp. "She did." "The whole thing?" Leona nodded. Alberta closed her eyes and whispered, "Then it's begun." That evening, Leona found a small envelope tucked behind the back door. No return address, just her name in looping script. Inside was a letter handwritten and a card from a professor at Morehouse College offering to meet Evie in Atlanta for a preparatory conversation. Within another 2 days came a call from the Georgia Arts Foundation offering Evie a full scholarship to attend a youth conservatory program in Savannah. And later that week, the Los Angeles Times ran an opinion piece penned by Dr. Eleanor Reese titled, "When the Genius Plays in Silence, Why Black Excellence Mustn't Always Ask Permission." The article didn't name Evie directly, but those who had seen the video knew exactly who it was about. Gideon Ashford, for his part, tried to pretend it hadn't happened. He gave a statement to the press. "We support young talent in all its forms," he said blandly. But the video didn't lie. It showed him leaning back in his chair, smirking, expecting to be amused. And it showed Evie not entertaining, not performing, but transforming the room one note at a time. The comment section was brutal. This man tried to embarrass her and ended up irrelevant. She didn't just play, she witnessed. They invited a child to entertain them. She made them listen. Victoria's social accounts went dark. Her friends stopped tagging her in memes. The internet had its own form of justice. And this time it was playing in a minor key. Back on the porch, Eleanor rose to leave. She took Evie's hand in both of hers. "You're going to have choices now," she said. "Doors will open." Evie nodded, unsure what to say. "But remember," Eleanor added, her voice low, "and even you never needed permission to be brilliant. You were already born that way." And then she walked down the steps, leaving the air humming behind her. Evie sat quietly, her fingers tracing an invisible scale across the wooden armrest of the chair. Tomorrow she would go back to the chapel. But this time she wouldn't be alone. People were listening now, and they wanted to hear. It didn't happen all at once. Sparks never do. They flicker first quiet and unsure until they find something dry enough to burn, and when they do, nothing stays untouched. By the end of that week, the video of Evie Mae's performance had crossed 1 million views. Not from promotion, not from hashtags, just from people sharing it the way you pass along something sacred. Like a hymn you don't fully understand but feel deep in the bone. No trending filter, no viral dance, just a girl at a piano and a room being changed. The first time Evie saw the video was on her mother's cracked phone. It was early morning just before sunrise. She'd gotten up to go to the chapel again, routine still rooted in her. But this time Leona stopped her. "You need to see this," she said, handing her the phone with shaking fingers. Evie watched it in silence, watched her own small body walk across the parlor, watched herself sit at that grand black Steinway, hands slightly trembling, breath held. She heard the first notes, unsure and soft. She saw the faces change in the room, saw them lean forward not out of amusement but realization. By the end, she didn't recognize herself. She looked older, not in age but in presence, like someone who had stepped into her own shadow and filled it. She handed the phone back. "What does it mean?" she asked. Leona just pulled her into a hug. "It means they see you now." But with visibility comes weight. The calls started slow. A journalist from a podcast in Memphis, a black arts collective in New Orleans, then PBS, then Good Morning America. They all wanted to know where she'd learned, who'd taught her, what she meant by the music. But Evie didn't always know how to answer that, because the music wasn't strategy. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't rebellion wrapped in melody. It was just honest. Every note was a memory, every measure a prayer. Every silence between chords held the breath of a grandmother who never got to tour, a mother who swallowed pride to survive, and a girl who thought she'd be invisible her whole life. One afternoon, a letter came from the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a full scholarship offer. Room, board, travel. "You've got something rare," the letter read. "We'd be honored to help you shape it." Evie read it out loud to Miss Alberta, who sat wrapped in 2 blankets and a quiet kind of awe. "Well," Alberta smiled, tears glinting in her clouded eyes, "I suppose the Lord ain't done with my fingers after all. Just passed 'em down." Meanwhile, back at the Ashford estate, things were quieter. Gideon walked slower now. He drank less, said even less than that. The piano, once a decoration, stood closed, untouched, its keys cold. He had tried to reclaim control, hired a publicist, issued a formal statement, something about supporting black excellence and celebrating young voices. But the internet had long memory and worse receipts. Screenshots of smirks, snide comments, captions from Victoria's since-deleted social posts. It was all out there, and no polished apology could take back what they all saw. As for Victoria, she stayed away from school for 2 weeks. Her friends didn't call. Her inbox was filled with messages she didn't dare open. The video had turned her from privilege to punchline overnight. But one day she knocked on Leona's back door. Evie opened it. They stood in silence. Finally, Victoria held out a thin music folder, old dog-eared, full of sheet music. "I can't play these the way you can," she said, not looking up. "Maybe you'll do them justice." Evie took the folder gently. "Thank you," she said. "Not as a favor, not as forgiveness, just truth." That Sunday, Evie was invited to play at the Juneteenth celebration held at the town green just across from the burned-down school where Miss Alberta had once taught. Hundreds came, some who had never heard classical music, some who had once sworn they didn't care for highbrow notes. But they came. And when Evie stepped onto that stage with the sun hanging low and warm behind her, she didn't bring sheet music. She brought memory. She played the same piece, the one from the Ashford parlor. Only this time she added something new, a final refrain, soft, slow, rising, something hopeful, like a curtain being pulled back on a world that had always been there waiting to be heard. Afterward, an older man in a denim shirt and wide-brimmed hat walked up to her. He smelled of pipe smoke and pine. His hands were cracked like old bark. "You played that from a place I recognize," he said. Evie looked up. "Where's that?" He tapped his chest. "Here." The place they tried to bury but forgot was still breathing. He tipped his hat and walked away. Back home that evening, Evie sat by the window in silence. The wind stirred the curtains. Distant voices from the street below faded. And in the quiet, she smiled. Not because she'd won anything, but because she'd spoken. And for once, no one talked over her. 5 months later, Evie Mae stood beneath the arching lights of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for the Arts in Atlanta. Her shoes were polished, her braids neatly tied with a single satin ribbon. The air buzzed with anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, strangers, and teachers who had once taught her to spell her name on wide-lined paper. But tonight she wasn't a student. She was the composer. She walked across the stage alone and sat at the baby grand, her fingers brushing the keys like greeting an old friend. And then without introduction, she began to play the same piece, the one she had played in the Ashford parlor, the one that had changed everything. Only now, It was different, slower, fuller, like a wound that had been closed but left its ache behind. The last note hovered longer than it had before, not because of technique, but because of something deeper, something a child her age should not have had to carry, but had. When the final chord faded, there was no immediate applause, only breath, only awe, and then one by one they stood, all of them. Her mother, Miss Alberta in her chair, Eleanor Reese, teachers, strangers, those who had watched her video, and those who had once passed her without seeing. They stood because they knew this wasn't just about talent. It was about truth finally heard. Sometimes we teach our children to stay quiet in rooms that were never built for their voices. But what Evie Mae showed us is this. Your gift doesn't need permission. It doesn't need an introduction. It only needs courage. There will be places that try to shrink you. People who laugh before you've even begun. But when you speak, or when you play or paint, or write from the deep truth of who you are, the world doesn't just listen, it remembers. So if you're watching this and there's a song in you, literal or otherwise, don't wait for the room to be ready. Sing it anyway. If Evie's story stirred something in you, if you've ever been underestimated or seen someone shine when the world tried to dim them, leave us a comment and tell us who believed in your music before anyone else did. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Black Voices, where we honor the stories that history tried to silence, but the heart never forgot. We'll be here listening, always.